Hello and welcome to the Devonport Camera Club's Projected Images 4 competition results. The competition was judged by Bob Thomas and the club thanks him for his diligence and constructive feedback. We'll begin with the colour entries. Amazement by Heidi Bester. Although I like the colours and the composition, the blurred effect does not appeal greatly. Whether this was intentional or simply the result of hand-holding the camera, I don't know, but if the blurring was intentional, I'm not convinced that it was successful. The placement of the figure works well and the overall lighting is fine, but the end result is a little ambiguous. There is a slight tilt to the left which could easily be rectified. Banded Lapwing by Daryl Starkey. A nice capture both by bird and photographer, with the worm adding interest to the image. I feel that the bird is a little swamped by the surrounding greenery, and perhaps cropping the image might have focused our eyes more on the central subject. As it stands, the successful capture of the worm is largely overcome by the dominance of the greenery. Branch, Rock, Sunlight, Condominium Creek by David Bluedorn. This is an unusual exposure, and it's always good to see people thinking out of the square by trying something new. Whilst I applaud the idea, I'm not sure that it's been successful on this occasion, as it leaves too many questions as to what's actually happening here. As it stands, it falls somewhere between abstract and creative, and although we can see the aim of the image, it lacks a coherent story and a clear message. There is insufficient clarity as it stands, and the peripheral areas don't really add much to the central theme. Dragonfly by Julie Phillips. Hard to capture but nicely caught. The depth of field is so shallow that you've lost the most rearward part, which is a shame. Perhaps next time opt for a slightly smaller aperture. The angle is a little off and might have been better caught from a different position. The main issue, however, is the lack of detail and focus, which needed to be through his entire body. Eastern Spinebill by David Hunter. A clean shot showing the bird in action, which is probably more interesting than simply catching him sitting on a branch enjoying the view. Ideally, we need to be able to focus on the bird rather than having to combat the surrounding distractions. Unfortunately, he's been swamped a little here and overcome by competing elements. I would suggest perhaps desaturating the foliage so that our eyes are directed to the bird rather than his environment. You could also do a progressive desaturation so that the immediate flowers are still colourful, but the less important ones merge into the background. Finlay Loves Rocks by Leanne Cowan. This is a cute shot and one that Finlay's owner will no doubt love. However, in the context of a photographic competition, it really needs a little more. And you might have been better finding a more attractive place for him to sit, without the rather ugly steelwork distracting our eye. Dogs are usually cooperative and willing models, so don't give up on him. Just find a more interesting canvas on which to paint his story. It would also be good to produce a higher resolution shot to maximise the impact of your images. This is rather too small for competitions. Grotty Bucky Beach by Julie Phillips. A lovely day for photography, although perhaps not the best time of day given the harsh and contrasty light. The image needs to capitalise more on the location and to embrace more of a story. The old machinery might have potential if you could find a vantage point to use it to advantage. As it is, it doesn't really add to the story and has no role to play. There are lots of interesting coastline locations, but in order to make yours stand out, you need to find a focal point that lends more interest to the overall shot. Infinity by Anne Starkey. This is a really nice canvas and ideal as a stage for a main act. The problem is that it lacks that main feature. There are all manner of things that would look really good using this image as the background or supporting cast, but as it stands, it tends to lack that point of focus or subject. If you're into compositing or improvising your images by added subject material, then this is a great place to do so. Oatlands Windmill by David Hunter. Few photographers can pass a windmill without taking a shot, so the key is to make it interesting and individual. This has a framework of foliage, but the angle is not perhaps the best one. Of course, there may not have been a better angle available, but I would have liked to see more of the blades and a more complete shot of the whole windmill. Reflections of Turner's Beach by Leanne Cowan. This image hasn't been presented at a sufficiently large size to really assess its value. At 135 kilobytes, you are really not capitalizing on the amount of available real estate. That said, it could be improved by adjusting the various sliders in your software, such as contrast, saturation, or dehaze. As it stands, the image is a little washed out and could do with a little boost to bring out the shades and tones that are currently hidden. The Walkers by Tony Sobolewski. This is a good silhouette, but perhaps not presented in the most appealing way. The room lacks any interest, so does not contribute to the end result. As the primary focus is the couple, it might have been more effective to crop the image more tightly, removing the uninteresting aspects and allowing us to focus our attention on the couple. Cropping it to either a square or a rectangle produces a much more interesting and focused image. Thirsty Roo by Rob Dawkins. I like that you've captured his tongue as he drinks, as that contributes more to the overall value of the image than any of the other aspects. There's a little more sharpness that can be extracted from this image, and it's worth revisiting that, given that the long lens has not produced as much detail as one might have liked. Village Museum by Judy Dawkins. A pleasant record of where you were, but not perhaps capitalising on the many possible shots there are to be found at this location. It's good that you managed to eliminate incongruous tourists, but I think experimenting with different angles, positions and subjects might have produced a more imaginative result, given the many historic buildings and artefacts available. Moving the camera to the right could have brought in those buildings on the left, which would have been more interesting than the plants on the right-hand side. Moving around or going low to try different vantage points often reveals more useful options and is always worth the extra time. Waldheim Walkway by Margaret Sobolewski. The Waldheim Walkway should present many opportunities for photographers, but unfortunately this particular shot does not really reflect that potential. Ideally, unless you are highlighting a specific aspect, such as an environmental issue, the aim is to capture the most appealing aspect of your location. The building in the background adds nothing of value and would have been better avoided. It would be an easy fix to simply crop the image just below that building, which would have immediately elevated the composition and presented a more appealing outlook. By now, many of you will be holding your hands horizontally across the projected image, trying to visualize that crop. And this is something we all need to do when taking or processing our images. Always look at the background as well as the foreground, because both are important. Bridal Veil Falls by Bob Goodwin. A hard-to-capture location given the sheer height of the falls. You've managed to do so quite well, although I might have liked a little more on either side, just to provide more context for the falls. Perhaps just a glimpse of the sky might have helped as well, allowing us to share a broader view of the whole scene. I rotated the image to the right by 1.9 degrees and found that it made the overall sensation more realistic to my eye. Mostly, we like to ensure that our image reflects the original orientation, but sometimes an artificially introduced change to the vertical can actually feel more natural to the observer. There is another image in this competition that this also applies to. Crater Falls by Tony Sobolewski. There are two schools of thought with running water. One is to use a fast shutter and freeze the water flow, and the other is to do the opposite. This is the approach taken here, and it has achieved its objective very well. The sense of movement has been captured well, although perhaps losing a little sharpness in the process. The sharply contrasting brightness levels between the water and the shadows has been a bit of an issue, and perhaps exposure bracketing might have helped to avoid the blown out area in the middle. Eye to Eye by Brad Stagg. The eye is always key, and you have captured that aspect well with the catchlight and sharpness. The bird is nicely isolated and the whole image sharp where it matters. Perhaps slightly oversaturated, I found that the image appeared a little more natural when I toned it down slightly. When processing colourful subjects, it's often tempting to push the saturation, but if you push it too far, you risk undue exaggeration. In the Pink by Brad Stagg. A nice shot which could be improved in a couple of areas. Firstly, the blurred foreground is rather distracting and would be better off either removed or replaced. Possibly artificially created, it tends to take our eyes away from the main focal point. The other issue, a common one, is that the image is oversaturated, which brings with it an unrealistic colour palette. Most images benefit from a bit of a colour boost, but you just need to be wary of overdoing it. Not Travelling Far Today by Jenny King. They made things tough back in the day, but this one has almost seen its last. I liked the desaturated background, although I might have also liked to have seen a bit more of the surrounding machinery just to give it context. As it stands, the toolbox is a little isolated rather than being party to a bigger story. Placing it centrally means that it's more of a mugshot than a representation of it in a broader context. Porticus, Shadowed Minimalism by David Bluedorn. An interesting choice, well spotted. This is a case where harsh lighting and shadows benefit the image rather than being a problem. I'd probably crop some off the top, as it doesn't add all that much having such a great expanse, and that would change the image ratio to a better shape. Silver Eye by Daryl Starkey. A nice pose, facing the camera and primed for action. The lighting is a bit tricky and the exposure is a bit blown out around the neck area. A reasonable capture at a long focal length. The Singer by Baden Smith. Quite well done and an interesting choice of subject. Always useful to have a subject with unusual or prominent features, and the detail has been captured quite nicely. If he is indeed a singer, then it would have been helpful to have included some of the surrounds, such as a microphone, so as to provide context and a bit of a story. As it stands, we're not able to identify him as a singer, relying instead on the image title to explain the backstory. This is the Life by Jenny King. This is a clean, sharp image, which is technically sound and well taken. Possibly better suited to a specific set subject competition, it could do with something more to lift it into a higher level of competition. I sometimes pose the question, is your image a wall hanger? And ideally the answer would be in the affirmative. If it's simply a pleasant image, then the aim is to try and elevate that image to something anyone would be happy to hang on their wall. Time Passed by Baden Smith. I think this might be a little past the renovator's dream stage and into the kindling phase of its life. A great subject and well captured. As a record of what you saw, it is sharp and detailed, but it would be great to find a more creative angle somehow. Perhaps taking it from a different position, experimenting with HDR, or maybe finding a suitable person or animal to include in the frame. Always step back and try to envisage a different perspective to all your images so that you create more than simply a record, but also something with added value that makes it stand out. This is especially important when out with a group of photographers, if you want to take home an image that stands out from the crowd. Tree Snake by Bob Goodwin. I love the way you've focused on the head to the exclusion of all else. Our eyes are drawn to his, and his head becomes very much the centre of attention. You've also managed to avoid any distracting peripheral elements so that, yes, this is all about him, or her, as the case may be. A slight crop would improve this image as there is a little too much wasted space. Yellow-Footed Rock Wallaby by Judy Dawkins. Nice capture and well composed. The tail following the line of the rock makes an interesting profile, and the wallaby is engaged and looking towards us. A little selective processing around the eyes would help, particularly if you could bring out the highlights. Our eyes are automatically drawn to his, and with just a small adjustment, you should be able to lighten his face just enough to bring out that extra detail. Do Not Disturb by Anne Starkey. This is a fabulous capture, and the colours and shades are very pleasing and dramatic. The photograph, complete with reflection, adds the icing to this cake, and the dramatic skies complete the overall impact. This is another case where departing from the normal rules can help a little. The waterline is actually completely level, but an optical illusion tends to give the scene a very slight lean to the left. Rotating the image half a degree compensates for this and makes the overall impact slightly better, to my eye at least. Historic House in the Field by Gil Hayes. This is a really pleasant shot of one of the iconic buildings from a past life. When you look at the way today's houses are pulled down and replaced, it's encouraging to see how long places like this have lasted. The colours here are brilliant, and the overall impact works very well. I would have liked something else in the shot to give it a little bit more life, and I'd also have liked the house to have been positioned to one side or other rather than centrally. It's a really good capture of the subject, but perhaps just needs something else to complete the picture. Hornbill with Lunch by Mike Jones. Fabulous capture, and you couldn't have isolated the hornbill's lunch better. The depth of field is just right, and the background nicely varied, yet unobtrusive. It's a Hard Life by Rob Dawkins. A nice farmland portrait with the ubiquitous rusting piece of broken farm machinery. There are so many of these residual pieces of history, and they always serve a useful purpose for photographers. Nicely spotted and well taken. I'm not sure I'd keep that bunch of grass in the foreground, but it doesn't really matter. Prague at Night by Mike Jones. A very pleasant and unusual river scene, given the number of bridges. The nighttime lights provide some visually pleasing effects. The image has a distinctly blue cast to it, which is a little unnatural. There are a couple of options that would make this less of an issue. either adjusting the white balance or reducing the blues via the colour equaliser. Each produces different effects, but both improve the overall colour balance, in my view. What a Gloomy Day by Heidi Bester. The contrast between the white building and its surroundings gives this image impact. The cloudy, overcast weather is your friend here and accentuates that contrast. Despite those factors, the image is a little too dark, although that is easily rectified by a quick adjustment in software. That will bring out just a little more detail in the mountains and foliage without spoiling the really nice impact of the church. Wilderness by Gil Hayes. This is a really nice image and one that falls into my wall hanger category. The composition is excellent and the exposure has been brilliantly handled. The slow shutter has produced the intended milky water movement. Because there's no leafy vegetation to move around, the slow shutter has not resulted in any collateral movement blur, which sometimes happens. The image is sharp and engaging and one to be proud of. Banksia by Anne Starkey. An interesting high-key effect, reducing the Banksia to its fundamental framework. I might have preferred a little more of the plant to be included rather than retaining just the central core. That core is, however, nicely defined and sharp and holds promise if the effect were to be expanded a little more. Fast Asleep by David Hunter. A decent close-up portrait of this chap, although perhaps lacking in much of a story. Hard to suggest what you might change, but perhaps the image is just a bit too close without including any contextual information or environmental content. Perhaps showing a little more of him, plus some idea of where he was, might have helped. Make Hay While the Sun Shines by Jenny King. The sunburst attracts our attention, and the typically dilapidated timbers and gate represent farm buildings generally. The image is sharp and photographically competent, although perhaps needing something more to maintain our interest. The hay bales are not sufficiently prominent to provide that focus, and it may have been better to have opened the gate and allowed us to see inside the structure. View from the Bathhouse by Margaret Sobolewski. This image is okay as far as it goes, but needs to go a little further. The dark right-hand side doesn't add much, which effectively leaves us with a very tall, skinny image. Perhaps using exposure bracketing might have expanded the right-hand exposure and provided some texture and interest, but as it stands, around a quarter of the image isn't really contributing much. Campfire by Brad Stagg. A rugged face well captured without peripheral distractions. The focus is on the face and eye as it should be, and you have captured the essence of your subject. I'd probably remove the light streaks on the bottom left, as they are a little distracting. An easy fix which would improve the overall image just a tad. Highland Hut by Rob Dawkins. Building this home must have posed a challenge, given the unforgiving landscape. The sky here lacks character and is a bit bland, and perhaps might have benefited from a little manipulation. The rock formation in the foreground adds a lot to the overall interest and lifts the image. Houdini Waiting to Escape by Julie Phillips. A cute image nicely focused on the cat and using depth of field to reduce the intrusion of the background. Perhaps a subtle vignette might have also helped in that regard, given that the background lacks interest. Sunrise, Moonset, Cathedral Mountain by David Bluedorn. There is potential in this shot which perhaps hasn't been fully realised. The tree line in the foreground has much more detail waiting to be discovered, but it's somewhat overwhelmed by the sheer size of the cloud formation. It may well be that a colour version of this shot might work a little better by providing contrasting colours and placing different emphasis on various parts of the scene. An impressive cloud formation nonetheless. The Cog by Gil Hayes. A bit of effort has gone into composing this compilation, and it works quite well. The featured cog stands out and draws our eye into the image, and the other elements provide a secondary focus. It's possibly better suited to a specific set subject, although a fellow photographer I know is always in seventh heaven when surrounded by anything mechanical. Well suited to a monochrome image, it provides the viewer with a jigsaw for the eyes. Trawler by Bob Goodwin. Who doesn't like a good boat shot? And this one is certainly that. The reflections add a little life to what is essentially a static image. There is more detail that can be extracted from the main hull, and you'll find that a little tweaking using your light equalizer or curves brings out that detail and improves the image. Lake Pedder by Margaret Sobolewski. Quite a striking image with nice tonality and very sharp. I am not convinced that the right-hand side contributes much to the overall scene, and it makes the overall panorama rather too wide. Cropping off the right-hand quarter improves the image, with all the remaining elements then contributing equally to what would be a much better image. Left to the Elements by Darryl Starkey. The shadows and textures combine here very well, and the variations in the sky provide a supportive role to complete the image. The overall balance of shades makes the image a pleasing and well-exposed portrait of the building. Pandani Patrol by Baden Smith. Looking a little like strange creatures, these plants remind me of an alien invasion as they march towards us. The overall palette of grey shades in this image gives a well-balanced and homogeneous feel, and the image is sharp throughout. Not a lot to suggest, as you've captured the scene well and chosen a very appropriate viewpoint to represent the location. Pioneer Cottage by Judy Dawkins. Another uniquely Australian building maintained in good condition for posterity. The exposure captures detail in the shadows and the framing is well handled. I like the overall lighting balance so that there are no unduly bright or dark spots. Three Phase by Brad Stagg. Well seen and captured, the three birds are well detailed and the composition is great. I would suggest cloning out the bolt and strut as they don't add anything and are a little distracting. The texture in the timber adds to the impact, and overall it's a simple but effective image. Weindorfer's Bathhouse by Tony Sobolewski. A very photogenic location and an ideal subject. The various textures work well together, and the steps provide a leading line along with the handrails. The image is a little dark in places, and exposure bracketing could have lightened up those darker areas, such as the doorway. The square format works okay, but perhaps a little more on the sides could have helped as well. Wild Child and Puppy by Leanne Cowan. Good eye contact here and a well-captured, tightly framed and spontaneous interaction between the participants and photographer. All that's missing is some detail in the dog's eye, but that could be added in post-processing. A shot that no doubt will be treasured by the family. Elephant Kruger by Mike Jones. An ideal monochrome subject. Colour is a little superfluous in this image. The direct eye contact and confrontational attitude gives the elephant character and engages nicely with the photographer. The image is sharp, the overall palette well handled, and overall a nice image. Look at All These People by Heidi Bester. There is a lot going on here, but not so much as to be cluttered. The two main stories work well together, with the selfie takers seemingly oblivious to the seagull, which is seen as owning the space and simply tolerating the intruders. The exposure has been well handled and the background is sufficiently muted to be unobtrusive. The leading lines draw our eye into the image, and there is much to occupy the viewer as we investigate further. I have been an active member of several Victorian camera clubs since 2006, including Eastern Suburbs, Camberwell, Melbourne Camera Club, and currently Waverley Camera Club. During the intervening years, I've run a variety of internal and external photographic training courses and written numerous newsletter articles on the subject. Externally, I taught photography at the University of the Third Age, presented lectures to libraries and community houses, and mentored new photographers as they began their own photographic journeys. I've won many club photographic competitions and awards and have participated on numerous panels and judging committees. I was awarded the VAPS Meritorious Service Award in 2020. Since 2017, I've regularly judged digital and print competitions for clubs in Victoria and other state competitions, plus internationally as required. I also judge for photographic groups outside the VAPS affiliated group of camera clubs and provide comprehensive written assessments. One of my primary interests lies in creative images and compositing. My overall philosophy is that images should always generate an emotion in the mind of the viewer, provided that the emotion is not one of apathy or indifference. A picture is worth 1,000 words, preferably engaging ones, and a good image should draw the viewer back looking for more.